Hello friends, today I'll be making a tree from a plastic sprue, crafting sandbags from air dry clay, and of course creating a diorama using these details. So let's move. This time I decided to make a diorama featuring a trench. As usual, I used XPS foam to create the base for this diorama. Making trenches is quite challenging, because I don't have a convenient tool, so I have to start by cutting out the shape of the trench in the foam and then work with tweezers. After that I decided to treat the foam a bit with a lighter. You have to be very careful using this method, because inhaling the fumes from the foam is highly dangerous and can seriously harm your lungs. But let's get back to my diorama. The result was, to say the least, unsatisfactory, so I decided to discard this base and create new one. Unfortunately, the second base also turned out poorly. Honestly, this is the first time I had to spend so much time just creating a base. It was all because I didn't have a clear picture in my mind of what I wanted to see on the diorama. Usually I get inspired by a dream, for example, like with the diorama of BT-7 tank and the railway crossing. It simply came to me in a dream. The same happened with the diorama featuring the T-34 tank, called as the Photo-etched. I saw the diorama in my dream as well. Or for instance with the urban combat diorama, which is one of the most popular on my channel. My hand just knew what to do. I didn't even have to think about it, I just built it as if I already knew exactly what needed to be done. But unfortunately, this time something went wrong, and as you can see, I've already ruined 2 bases. Honestly, it took me ruining 3 entire bases before I found one that worked. It turned out to be quite simple, I just needed to study the historical background and see how trenches were made during World War II. Since I'm once again making a trench with Soviet soldier, because I have more of them and they fit trench themes best, I had to research how soldiers dug trenches during World War II. Fortunately, I found exactly what I need. And choose the segment I liked, I started replicating it on my base. Luckily, my mind finally caught onto the idea of the diorama, and I began to see everything unnecessary that needed to be removed. You could say I finally caught the wave of this diorama. Once I finished working with the foam, it was time to focus on the detail you can already see on the screen. It's a small bunker made of wood. After my last video, I realized that saying "I already did this in the previous video" or "in some other video" is poor form, and it's better to show the same technique, even if it's from one video to the next. So we returned to the method of creating a tree from leftover plastic sprue that you might have after building figures or model tank, car or even airplanes. The first step in simulating a tree from leftover plastic sprue is to remove any excess part using a hobby knife. You need to take this tree as smooth as possible and remove all unnecessary elements. You can also use the hobby knife to reduce the diameter of the logs, but I was satisfied with the size of these logs, so I started cutting them to the required length. Next, you need to apply texture to the resulting logs using pliers. You simply squeeze the plastic cylinder, imprinting a texture onto it, and this is the result. I discovered this method when I was making a diorama with the Sherman tank, and at that time it worked perfectly. I believe this is a universal way to create logs for diorama of any setting, whether it's World War I, World War II or even medieval dioramas. This method is perfectly for any scale and any purpose. As you can see, I ended up with some beautiful logs. Now it's time to glue them together and shape them into a wooden bunker, which was commonly used by various sites during World War II. These bunkers usually housed machine gun nests. Thanks to such bunkers and temporarily firing points, the machine gun crew was protected from stray bullets. And of course, a fortified position like this could resist and hold off the enemy for much longer. In the end, I made a pretty decent wooden bunker. Of course, it could be further refined in the future, but honestly, I don't plan on making many adjustments. I might close some gaps and a few extra elements, and that will be it. For now it remains as it is, and we will move on. And this transition doesn't mean I'll be doing something new or creating additional elements. I'm just going to show you the assembled anti-tank rifle. 8th Company makes a realistic weapon like this for 1/72 scale. This level of quality is more than enough for me, and it complements my theme perfectly. So if you are looking for a more realistic weapon for your 1/72 scale, I can recommend this set. This isn't an advertisement. I actually use this set myself and have used it in 3 dioramas already. In fact, I am very careful with it because, unfortunately, these sets are becoming increasingly hard to find. This is essentially the last small detail that will be included in my diorama. Now we can return to the diorama, and as you are probably already noticed, I did some work with a lighter, giving the diorama a slightly different look. I should mention that working with a lighter is a very delicate technique. On one hand, you could damage the texture. For example, if I had used this lighter on a diorama with medieval gates, it would likely have destroyed all my bricks. But in the case of this strange diorama, the lighter made the foam as hard as stone, which allows me to work with it without worrying that any of the material will melt it. It also worth noting that the foam base treated with a lighter can be painted with acrylic right away. At least Vallejo acrylics won't react with the foam or melt it. But I felt it was necessary to use texture paste. On top of that, my trenches looked too wide because I overdid it with a lighter. I want to solve this problem creating good texture paste. But before creating the texture paste and applying it to the diorama, I added wooden panels to the base to make the edges look more finished. This time I used balsa wood again, because working with thin wooden panels is more challenging. And in the case of this diorama, wooden panels would have likely ruined it rather than enhanced my work. Here is what it looks like after adding the wooden panels. Now we can move on to making my favorite texture paste. I have 2 favorite types of this texture paste. The first option is sand, PVA glue and acrylic paint. The second option is plaster, PVA glue and acrylic paint. In this video I will be using the first option because sand can create a pleasant texture that I need. The only problem and mistake I made this time was using too much PVA glue. As you can see, during the application process the texture paste spreads very quickly and doesn't hold its shape well. However, it does retain a basic shape, so this result is sufficient for me. Here is what it looked like after drying and adding the main elements. You can see a slightly improved wooden bunker here. I decided to make it somewhat larger, so it would look more fortified. I also used a balsa wood to create wooden shield that I placed along the edges of the trench. Firstly, this is a precautionary measure to prevent the trenches from collapsing. Secondly, it also helps reduce the width of the trench, which was too wide for 1/72 scale. Additionally, you can see a large crater on the right side of the diorama. I thought it would be interesting to create the effect of an old crater. For example, a shell might have landed there, blown up part of the trench, and now there is crater with some charred broken boards. I also wanted to experiment with the ash effect. I've seen it used by several YouTubers and wanted to try it myself, as our hobby involves constant improvement and learning new things. And as you might have noticed, while explaining all this, I was also test fitting the models on the diorama, and whether all the models are in their proper place and fit well within the scene. I can say that the placement of these details completely satisfied me, except for the machine gun, which I wanted to place in the wooden bunker. I miscalculated a bit and the bunker is too deep, so the machine gun simply doesn't reach the designated hole, where it should be positioned for firing. So, before installing it, I'll need to think about fixing this issue. But for now, I'm mixing Milliput, using the yellow variant this time. Firstly, I want to test my silicone sculpting tool, which I recently purchased from one interesting website. Secondly, I want to try creating sandbags, which will be placed around the perimeter of the trench. You can't really say that these sandbags provide excellent protection against bullets and shrapnel, but you know, if there's even a 1% chance that they might help, I think it's worth using them. That's what these soldiers thought too. As for these silicone tools, I think they are doing their job quite well. The only problem is creating the sandbags, of course, is my hands. I am far from being a professional sculptor, and I should really work on improving this skill. So if you have any advice, I'd be happy to hear it. I'd appreciate if you leave your suggestion in the comments. I always make sure to read all the comments and I try to respond to all of them as well. For now, these are the sandbags I'll make. I can't say they are bad, but I definitely not going to price them either. They fulfill the role of an additional detail in the diorama. After sculpting these handbags, I had a lot of material left over, so I decided to use it to fill in the all unwanted gaps in the diorama. Unfortunately, during the creation process I made many mistakes, resulting in a lot of extra gaps. Thankfully, with Milliput I can correct all these mistakes and fill in all the necessary gaps. I also made a few tarps from this material, as I want to give it another try. I'm sure that the reason it didn't work out last time was that I used it incorrectly. Now I want to redeem this material in my eyes and create a really good tarp out of it. So, using baby powder, I roll the material out very thinly to achieve the appropriate thickness for a tarp in 1/72 scale. And after that's done, I place the first detail on my diorama. A dead soldier covered with a poncho, essentially a small tarp. After adding the soldier body and covering it with a tarp, my silicone tools come into play again, beautifully shaping the tarp. Just look at how great it looks. After that, I decided to place a second tarp on the corner of the wooden bunker, since that part of the diorama looked too empty and needed something to fill it in. The last detail where I will use this material will be a sandbag parapet for the machine gun. The method is the same, but I wanted to make the sandbag legs deformed this time and see how they would look after painting. Overall, they turned out even better than the previous ones, probably because the material had hardened a bit by then. I realized that it's better to let this material rest for about 10 or 15 minutes before working with it. But it's also important to understand that if you let the material rest, you'll have less time to work with it, so it's a double-edged sword. In general, this diorama began to take on some interesting shapes, but I felt it was lacking in small detail. The first detail I added was a soldier's helmet, left on the parapet by one of the troops. I worked a bit on the wooden bunker and added a special wooden shield beneath the machine gun, so it could fit perfectly in the bunker. The result of this work was satisfactory, but I still felt something was missing, so I began filling the trench's floor with various planks, that the soldier used to avoid wading through mud in the trench. Because all the rainwater collects in earthen trench, it became impossible to move without placing some boards to prevent the soldier from getting stuck in the mud. After that, I added a few similar boards on top of the wooden bunker, just to create an additional detail. And I must say that this was the last detail needed for this diorama. Now we can start painting. The first step in painting, of course, is priming. As usual, I use black primer and cover the entire diorama with it. And after priming, this diorama starts to look more like a cohesive thing, with all the elements unified by the same color. This gives it a sense of completeness and sets the stage for further painting, which will bring life and detail to the scene. The first step after priming was painting the ground. However, this time I decided not to cover the entire surface. Instead, I used a dry brushing technique with 3 shades of brown to create the effect of dry, compacted soil in certain areas. I think this approach works well, and the result looks quite good. And now on screen you can see which color was used. And what do you think about it? Let me know in comment section. Next, I moved on to the second part of the ground area on the diorama, using the same method. After that, I started painting the sandbags. Although they could have been painted using the dry brushing technique, but this time I opted to apply a base color. I used base flash from the Panzer SS series by Vallejo for the sandbags. On top of this base layer, I applied a lighter color using the dry brushing technique. Don't be surprised that the colors of the ground and the sandbags are very similar. My theme depicts a post-battle situation, so it's natural that everything could be covered in dust and share a similar hue with the ground. Now I painted the soldier's helmet green. A slightly more olive color was used for the tarp covering the soldier body. Once it dried, I again used the dry brushing technique to add highlights, making the tarp look worn and old. The result turned out quite well. I'll let it wash later and it will look perfect. However, I felt the sandbags weren't weathered enough, so I mixed an even lighter shade and applied additional highlights to all the sandbags on the diorama. Some might think it's overdone, but trust me, after adding the wash everything will look just right. Next, it was time to paint all the wooden parts. I started by applying chocolate brown from Vallejo to all the wooden elements. Then, using lighter tones and again applying the dry brushing technique, I added highlights to all the wooden parts of my diorama. I decided to start with the wooden bunker. Again, I might have overdone it in some spots, but the wash will cover any unwanted areas. For now, let's take a quick look at how the wooden parts turned out after painting. I think the result is more than satisfactory, and for small dioramas like this, it's quite decent. With that, I can say that the painting is finished. Due to limited camera memory and the little time I could dedicate to my hobby, I had to do a lot of camera. For instance, I painted the machine guns off camera, as well as the figures. Unfortunately, the painting process wouldn't be shown in the video. I hope you can forgive me for that. Now we return to the demonstration, starting with placing the grass on the diorama. I prepared the grass in advance, as I showed you in a previous video. Now I just need to cut it onto small pieces and place it on the diorama. Some tufts of grass look unnatural, with the base being too visible and ruining the overall appearance of the diorama. Additionally, the superglue left a lot of shine, but believe me, all of this can be fixed by carefully painting over the areas that needed to be hidden. As you know, I don't use much grass in my dioramas, and this one is no exception. I'm not sure why, but I still haven't mastered making good grass on dioramas, so I only use small tufts. And here is how the diorama looks at this point. It still needs work on the crater where the shell landed. As I mentioned earlier, I want to try creating an ash effect in this area. Unfortunately, I had to work on the ash effect off camera again, and I can say that the ash effect looks quite decent, and I will definitely use it in the future. For now, let's take a look at the final result. This is what I ended up with. The diorama is completely finished, the figures are in place, and everything looks great. I think it's a simple diorama, but I still learned something new, specifically how to make trenches look good. At the very least, they are not too narrow, and someone looking at the diorama can actually see what's in them. Secondly, I've learned how to fix the issue caused by pre-made grass. Thirdly, I improved my skill working with Milliput, which is an achievement in itself. And finally, I hope I showed you something new, or if not, that I present something I will shown before in more detail, or from a different angle. And this what I do, helping you learn something new or reinforce what you already know. With that, we move on to the final demonstration process, and I bid you farewell, my friends. This is, as always, Vlad from Noquality channel. Subscribe to my channel if you found this interesting, and if you don't want to, you don't have to. That's your choice. Give this video 10 wooden bunker out of 10 if you like it, and if not, you can always go to comment section and tell me what I'm doing wrong, what you didn't like, because as you know, an outside perspective always helps you improve. I look forward to your constructive criticism. On that note, I say goodbye to you until the next video. Take care everyone!